Today, I will discuss a border crossing that changed the world. For many scientists, crossing this border marked an irreversible tipping point in human history comparable to major events in Earth's history. It's likely the most significant event since the dinosaurs vanished, as it triggered epidemics causing tens of millions of deaths. Collapse of civilizations, displacement of European and African populations, and radical global ecosystem upheaval, and all in extremely short periods of time. We even indirectly owe it the French Revolution, Rio Carnival, Hawaiian pizza, chili con carne, and ratatouille. This event, known as the Great Columbian Exchange, shaped the world. As spectacular and irreversible as massive volcanic eruptions or a meteorite impact, it was initially triggered by a few hundred men who crossed an ocean. Now, let's return to our story, which starts in the early 15th century, by developing a new kind of ship, the Caravels, with their square and triangular sails. The latter aren't limited to tailwinds to advance. They are maneuverable, handle open sea waves, and carry up to 150 tons of supplies. Before Caravels arrived, the world was vast, and most civilizations were separated by oceans. Western Europe and the Far East remained largely disconnected, with their trade and intellectual exchanges hindered by the dominant influence of Muslim nations, who, at the center of the Old World, largely controlled the gateways to the Silk Roads. Further south, sub-Saharan Africa and its rich coastal empires traded little with Europe and were mostly unknown to East and South Asian civilizations. As for what we might call the Eastern and Western hemispheres of the world, the Old and the New World, they developed in complete ignorance of each other's existence. But with the development of the caravel in Europe, it became possible to lose sight of the shore for a long time, to venture far beyond the horizon into the vast oceans. And when, in 1492, the expedition of Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean after crossing the Atlantic Ocean with his improved ships, it would trigger a series of events that, in turn, would have global consequences. In just a few generations, these new ships dramatically changed the ecosystems and societies of both hemispheres through increased exchange and mixing, to the point of shattering political balances and forever changing the history of life on Earth. African slaves find themselves in the highlands of South America, extracting silver from mines dug into the ruins of the Inca Empire, silver that will be sold in China by the Spanish. In Mecca, Manila, and Madrid, the scent of Caribbean tobacco fills the air in thick clouds. Spanish merchants are waiting for their porcelain and their Asian evening coming from Mexico. Much of the trade with China at that time went through Central America. Meanwhile, along the Indian Ocean, Dutch sailors used shells from the Maldives as currency to trade for slaves from Angola. What many people didn't know at that time was that, in the holds of the ships, the most precious loot brought back by conquistadors from America to Europe wasn't made of gold or silver, but of plants and seeds. Meanwhile, in the galleons sailing toward the New World, the most dangerous passengers didn't carry weapons or armor, but were living beings, invisible microbes that had made their home on peaceful domestic animals, and who, swept up in the world's upheaval, would disrupt the continent's balance. By arriving in the Americas, Europeans unintentionally caused things to collide and mix. Two worlds, each with diverse ecosystems, plants, animals, and pathogens, had remained separated by an ocean for millions of years without contact. Now, within a few decades, horses, cows, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, dogs, and cats were introduced to the Americas, along with wheat, rye, rice, coffee, garlic, and onion. Meanwhile, tomatoes, potatoes, beans, peanuts, peppers, papayas, vanilla, cocoa, squash, cassava, tobacco, sunflowers, avocados, sweet potatoes, and more were brought from the Americas to be grown in India, China, and Southeast Asia, before being consumed sometime later in Africa, Europe, and then Australia. Naturally, long before the conquistadors arrived, species had already moved from Eurasia to America, notably through the Bering Strait or by island hopping across the Pacific and vice versa. However, these rare transfers affected only a few species. Nothing as massive and rapid had ever happened until then. To fully understand the importance of these first transatlantic journeys, let's rewind history a bit to focus on the fascinating figure of Christopher Columbus. Cristoforo, as he was sometimes called, grew up middle class in Genoa, an independent city-state and major maritime power expanding its trade across the Mediterranean and into the Black Sea. Columbus was not certain to change the world. First an apprentice weaver, then a cabin boy. At 10, he was a privateer during France's religious wars, continuing into his 20s. And then, by force of circumstance and by chance, as a seafaring man, he became a merchant and traveled to Portugal, England, and Iceland. At 30, he secured a position at the King and Queen of Castile's court, thanks to the books and maps he bought and sold. By interacting with intellectuals and the powerful, he gets the idea to cross the Atlantic. Columbus always dreamed of the Indies. This prosperous, legendary region east of Asia is rich in spices, silks, perfumes, and luxury tableware, which reach Europe slowly and expensively via Arab and Venetian merchants. Like many educated Europeans then, Columbus read Marco Polo's travel accounts and immersed himself in his Book of Marvels. He often dreams of reaching the Indies, Southeast Asia, and even the mythical lands of Cathay and Cipangu, China, and Japan. Since the mid-15th century caravels, other naval innovations allow the Portuguese to travel farther and farther south in an attempt to reach the Indies by sailing around Africa by sea. At this favorable moment in history for exploration, Columbus secures funding from the Spanish crown, a journey meant to reach the land of the rising sun by heading west. Basically, his idea is to head due west and cross the vast ocean separating Europe from the much-coveted Asia. What's funny is that it took years of negotiations to convince Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain to fund this high-risk journey. Columbus nearly got his project funded by King Charles VIII of France. It's easy to imagine a very different world history would have been written then. Surprisingly, Christopher Columbus's first expedition was likely funded mainly due to a miscalculation. To estimate the ocean size between Europe and Japan, and thus the expedition's duration and feasibility, Columbus relied on the observations of the great astronomer Al-Farghani, a 9th century Arab scholar whose calculations slightly underestimated the circumference of the Earth. And to this small initial error, Columbus would add a huge one. By confusing the distances given in Arabic miles with those given in Roman miles, he would further reduce the size of the world by more than a third. And it's this error that would make his plan to reach present-day Japan by crossing the ocean seem credible on paper, and it would finally convince the Spanish crown to agree to fund a project comparable in cost and danger to a spaceflight today. When Columbus's expedition departed the Canary Islands, the crew, according to their calculations, should reach Cipangu after traveling about 4,500 kilometers westward. In reality, they're 12,500 kilometers from the Japanese archipelago as the crow flies. No ship of that era could have made the journey without stopping. So the members of this expedition would probably all have died of hunger, lost in the middle of a vast ocean if the American continent hadn't existed, but the fact remains that this continent is there. In 1492, after 36 days of travel and nearly running out of supplies, the expedition members finally arrive on a small Caribbean island they call San Salvador. They are convinced that they are near the Japanese archipelago and the treasures of China. During the next 4 expeditions and until his death, Colón remained convinced he had set foot in Asia and that he was about to bypass Venice and the Ottoman Empire's trade routes to reach them. Colón's first expedition, which had only 3 ships and 90 men, and which only superficially touched a few islands of this new continent, was little more than a nudge. With upcoming world-changing events, a shift that truly only begins with the second expedition, which, much more ambitious in terms of manpower, was designed to establish itself with the 17 ships it included. There were nearly 1,500 people, including a third soldiers, a quarter craftsmen, merchants, farmers, blacksmiths and carpenters, and a fifth settlers, as well as dozens of priests who would be the first to sow the seeds of the Catholic religion in Latin America. 5 centuries later, there are nearly 500 million believers there. Within this expedition, no one knows but what will most profoundly change the Americas. It is neither the weapons, nor the ideas, nor even the 1,500 people who set sail to settle in this new world, but the 100 horses, 3 or 4 cows, and the 30 or so pigs, sheep, and goats, as well as the hundreds of chickens found in the holds, and which harbor a number of diseases that Europeans already carry and to which they are immune. Diseases that will spread like wildfire, much faster than the Spaniards across the entire continent, and bring the great American civilizations of the time to their knees even before the Europeans meet them. Suddenly, viruses such as smallpox, measles, flu, hepatitis, pneumonia, or bacteria like tuberculosis, diphtheria, cholera, typhus, or scarlet fever start to spread, by creating the greatest epidemic shock in human history, and perhaps even in the history of life on Earth. In just a few decades, and as various expeditions travel along the American coastline, the indigenous peoples of America are faced with several millennia of Eurasian epidemic waves. Waves that will sweep from the north to the south of the Americas and kill between 75 and 90% of the continent's inhabitants, most of whom will never have met a European in their lifetime. For comparison, the major plague outbreaks in Europe only decimated 50% of the population. And this carnage is nearly one-sided, because the only disease to make the journey in the opposite direction from the Americas to Eurasia is a sexually transmitted disease. Syphilis will cause its first Old World epidemic by 1495. But nothing comparable in terms of losses to the cataclysm caused in America. So, how can we explain that the pathogens passing from the Old World to the New were so numerous and virulent? Well, the reason is essentially that, unlike the cultures of Asia and Europe, those of America rarely lived in close contact with animals. If we set aside turkeys, the Mexican black dog, and llamas in the Andes, the sapiens of America had no domestic animals, while on the other side of the Atlantic, human populations lived with those they had domesticated. For millennia, many buildings were even dedicated to them, from barns to chicken coops to stables, while the doors of castles were sized so that a man on horseback could pass through, but none of that in the Americas. This proximity led to chronic health crises throughout the history of the Eurasian continent and a very poor state of health among Europeans. Many accounts from the first transatlantic travelers actually express their admiration for these men and women in very good health, with remarkable beauty and cleanliness. But don't be mistaken, even though animal domestication was quite rare, the American continent was far from being wild. 30 years after Colón's first voyage, Hernán Cortés entered Mexico's interior and discovered the remarkable city of Tenochtitlan, now Mexico City. He found a city with 200,000 to 300,000 residents. This made it one of the world's largest cities, though it was only half the size of overcrowded Beijing, the Chinese Empire's center. During Cortés's time, only Paris and Constantinople in Europe rivaled in population. As for Seville, which was then the seat of the Spanish crown, it was 4 times smaller than the Aztec capital. Besides its size, Tenochtitlan was an engineering marvel. Sitting in the middle of Lake Texcoco, this incredible city, built on artificial islands and crisscrossed by thousands of small boats, owed its survival to intensive agriculture. Just as spectacular, it was carried out on floating gardens called chinampas. And then, in this city, whose cleanliness and complexity amazed the armies of Cortés, before they began to meticulously destroy it. Domesticated animals were nearly absent, unlike European cities crowded with horses, pigs, chickens, ducks, and their droppings. It was in the first half of the 16th century that, by venturing into the interior of Mexico, Europeans discovered large quantities of fruits, vegetables, and grains that were unknown to them, and which had been domesticated by civilizations that had undergone their own Neolithic revolution and developed their own agriculture. And in doing so, they would spread these plants, which were just as new to them, all over the world and transform global agriculture. And to sum up this incredible story, let's take the example of a dish that, in our minds, evokes the cowboy lands of Arizona or Texas. Chili con carne, which originated in Mexico. A name that, by itself, already says something about the Great Columbian Exchange, because carne comes from Spanish and means meat, and chili in Nahuatl, the language spoken by the Aztecs, means pepper. But that's not the most interesting part, because whether you're more into chili, in the 19th century, the original version was mainly a stew of chili peppers, simmered meat, and spices, or whether you add rice, red beans, and tomatoes, or even corn or bell pepper, as is often the case today. Remember, the chili recipe is neither Texan nor Mexican, because it contains a part of humanity's heritage. The rice you can put in it was originally domesticated in the Yangtze Chuan Valley in China, about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. The garlic added comes from Central Asia and has been grown in the Mediterranean for over 5,000 years. Just like the olives, the oil that lets us fry it, and the beef that's added to it, and which is actually more likely to be a retired dairy cow than a castrated bull, comes directly from aurochs domesticated in the Near East 10,000 years ago. The so-called Mexican spices that are commonly added to it actually come from the other side of the world. It contains cumin originally from the Near East and oregano that first appeared in Europe, and ground coriander seeds, which originally grew wild in many places in the Middle East and Southern Europe. As for red beans, tomatoes, and chili peppers, all come from plants that 5 centuries ago only grew in the Americas and nowhere else in the Old World. Before the Great Columbian Exchange, no one in Europe, India, Africa, or China had ever tasted a single chili pepper. In fact, before the arrival of Europeans in America, there were no cowboys, no cows, and no horses on this side of the ocean. The idea of Native Americans as nomadic and on horseback is a result of the Columbian Exchange, a reaction of Native Americans to the upheaval that would take place a little later in the 18th and 19th centuries. Most signature dishes from world regions, often called ancient culinary traditions, are actually recent innovations, dishes that would never have existed without this biological collision between the old and new worlds. To show how the Columbian Exchange radically changed global cuisine, you can actually take almost any popular dish as an example. Here you have all the ingredients needed to make a ratatouille, a typical dish from the south of France. Now we'll separate what's needed for this recipe and found in the Old World from what originally grew in America. And here I think you see the problem. It also works very well with a Hawaiian pizza, an Italian dish popularized in New York that requires tomatoes originally from Mexico and pineapple, a fruit that originally only grew in South America and the Caribbean, and that was later mass cultivated in many tropical regions, including the island of Hawaii. If you take an ear of corn and, like me, you're a novice in botany, you probably only see the promise of a delicious dish. But for an agronomy researcher, it's a mystery because we still struggle to fully understand how, through selective breeding, the great civilizations of Mexico managed to cross grasses called teoscintes, a kind of giant weed, to the point of transforming the seeds that originally looked like this into this. Beyond the ancient agricultural practices of the New World, archaeologists have also recently discovered the remains of large human constructions that the conquistadors had completely overlooked. For a long time, the Amazon was seen as the ultimate untouched and wild land, yet despite its extraordinary biodiversity, it was inhabited by humans. In the lands of these regions, over the past decades, large quantities of charcoal, pottery, and fish remains have been found, dated from 800 to 500 AD, and which were deliberately accumulated to transform the poor and acidic soil of the Amazon River basin into an extremely fertile land, the famous Terra Preta. Even though these traces of activity, called anthrosols, are difficult to map in the largest equatorial forest on the planet, it is estimated that between 0.1 and 1% of the surface of the Amazon is made up of this particularly fertile anthrosol. These archaeological traces have upended the traditional estimate of the pre-Columbian Amazonian population, which was thought to be around 1 to 2 million people, to a range between 6 and 12 million. Researchers have also identified a higher density of fruit trees near major archaeological sites thanks to satellite imagery. They are now trying to identify areas of the forest that are particularly rich in fruit trees to locate new archaeological sites. So, at that time, the Amazon was both farmland and a vast orchard. And it was in one of these regions, long forgotten and reclaimed by the forest, in the north of present-day Bolivia, that it was first domesticated. The iconic cassava revolutionized tropical agriculture and cuisine, especially in Africa. The craziest part is that the collapse of Amerindian populations transformed more than just the landscapes, to the point that regions cultivated as far as the eye could see by human hands were, in just a few decades, taken over by dense forests. It also, probably and indirectly, disrupted the balance of the climate. Let me explain, you'll see, it's fascinating. When the Europeans landed on the American coasts, many large centers of sedentary population were thriving along the coast and inland. The Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast, as well as the Cherokee, Creek, and Appalachians, or also the peoples from the Mississippian civilization who would unite in the 17th century under the name Chactas. In the eastern future United States, every year the Native Americans would deliberately light large seasonal fires to control the growth of trees and to clear grazing areas for the large herbivores of these regions, such as deer and bison. By causing the collapse of Native American populations, European pathogens indirectly put an end to this control of vast territories through fire. However, these large intentional fires released significant amounts of carbon monoxide, into the atmosphere over just a few decades. After the epidemic shock, the forest regains ground and closes in throughout the entire eastern part of North America, capturing a large amount of carbon monoxide, in the process. It is estimated that in the span of a century, between Canada and Florida, an area equivalent to the size of France is affected, from prairie-type landscapes to dense forest, and this will have surprising consequences. It is believed that the regrowth of this immense forest may have contributed to triggering what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, a very long climatic episode that lasted nearly 3 centuries. And in the northern hemisphere, it was characterized by harsh winters, mild summers, and disastrous harvests, responsible for many famines and indirectly for extremely troubled political climates. The fall of the Ming Dynasty, American independence, and even the French Revolution were therefore somewhat fueled by hunger caused, among other things, by falling temperatures and irregular rainfall. Following the disappearance of Native Americans, whose numbers across the continent dropped in less than 2 centuries, from 60 million at the time of the arrival of the first Europeans to less than 4 million by the end of the 16th century, Of course, several other factors are involved and help explain the particularly sharp drop in temperatures occurring in the North Atlantic, from the 1550s to the late 19th century. Among them are a decrease in the intensity of our star's surface during this period, as well as particularly violent volcanic eruptions. Their ashes reflected some solar radiation back into space. The 1816 eruption of Indonesia's Tambora volcano killed over 100,000 people on nearby islands, and it caused a year without summer, which led to crop failures in China, America, and Europe, where famines also resulted in nearly 100,000 deaths. Except that these incriminated phenomena, sunspots and volcanoes combined, cannot clearly explain the duration of this little ice age on their own. So much so that some researchers assume that a third force may have been at work, that of the massive regrowth of trees in North America, which, by quickly sequestering large amounts of carbon monoxide, too, may have contributed to intensifying the cooling of the climate. This hypothesis is still debated, but I have to say that I like the idea that microbes indirectly contributed to lowering temperatures and intensifying them locally. Famines that may have triggered revolutions, like those leading to the founding of the United States or the fall of the French monarchy in 1789. Whether that's the case or not, what saved the lower classes of Europe at the end of the 18th century? It was the potatoes, not the revolutions, that caused the famine. When you think about it, aren't they the real jewels of the Columbian exchange? Because this modified underground stem, which we call a tuber and which came to us from the Andes, saved Northern Europe from famine. It fed them more cheaply and freed labor and resources for their colonial projects and 19th century industrialization. For all these reasons, many historians consider the potato to be the most important treasure brought back from the Americas. It must be said that the few varieties that took root in the cultures of the old continent changed everything. 4 times more productive per hectare than cereals, potatoes are able to grow in relatively poor soils, while being almost unaffected by bad weather, cold snaps, hail, or storms. In fact, if we continue to grow cereals, it's mainly because they're easy to transport and store, and also because we couldn't live without bread. And as the Irish say so well, it's better not to put all your potatoes in the same basket. During the first half of the 19th century, Ireland massively adopted the potato as a complement to milk and beer. This diet practically met all their needs. For nearly 40% of the population, the potato was even the only solid food they consumed. 3 researchers proved this diet's effectiveness in 1925. For 161 days, they ate nothing but potatoes with milk and beer. No deficiencies, no weight loss or gain, and no, I quote, overwhelming desire to change food. The potato is life, and it's also death, because the Great Columbian Exchange is an endless process. In 1845, blight, a microscopic fungus from North America, appeared in Ireland and destroyed 50% of the crops in just a few weeks. The following year, the blight took everything. The Columbian Exchange greatly benefited Europe. Suddenly, he starts again. In just a few years, Ireland will lose a quarter of its population. 1 million people will die of hunger there, and nearly 2 million others will be forced to flee the country and migrate to the United States, Canada, and Australia. And now the Irish have in turn become a part of the Great Columbian Exchange, of these waves of movement of plants, diseases, and humans. Today, it is estimated that 70 million people around the world have Irish origins. The island's combined North and South population is currently 6.3 million, far fewer than the 8 million people who lived on the island before the blight. In the world, and especially in Europe, the potato is also at the heart of the transformation from subsistence farming to industrial agriculture, which makes massive use of fertilizers and pesticides. The first fertilizer to be exported, sold, and used industrially was guano in the 19th century. They began to industrially exploit the large amounts of seabird droppings found on islands off South America's coasts, and which were used by the Incas to fertilize their potato fields. Long before the arrival of white men, between 1840 and 1880, Peru would export 12 million tons of this white gold, mined under inhumane conditions, until the deposits were exhausted, which would greatly enrich the country by providing it with 80% of its income, and allow farmland in Europe and North America to make a leap in productivity while making us dependent on nitrogen fertilizers from then on. At the end of the 19th century, to fight the mass arrival of another pest from the Americas, the Colorado beetle, or Dirifor of the potato, Northern Europe and the United States, traumatized by late blight, massively sprayed arsenic-based pesticides on tuber fields. It wasn't until the 1960s and the arrival of dichlorodiphenyltrichloroethane that the danger of this substance for the soil and humans was recognized. In China, it was sweet potatoes and corn that became stars and helped farmers escape famine during the Little Ice Age, while also permanently transforming the country. Less than a century after the first settlers, between 1580 and 1590, the rice fields in the Fujian Valley, the region in eastern China facing Taiwan, were badly affected by heavy rainfall. Famines continued until planting sweet potatoes on a large scale was ordered. In a century, China's population grew from 70 to 130 million, and the conquest of the arid and mountainous territories in the west of the Middle Kingdom by the Han ethnic group was made easier by the planting of sweet potatoes, and corn. These are plants capable of growing in the poor soils of these regions with impressive yields. It's not hard to imagine that without them, China and its dominant Han ethnicity would not have become the geographical giant we know today. It's just a small step forward. Today, China produces 3/4 of the world's sweet potatoes and is the second largest corn producer after the United States of America. And after talking about the influence of American plants on China and Europe, I need to talk to you about the considerable effects that the Great Columbian Exchange had on the African continent. Soon after the first settlers arrived, Europe needed labor to exploit New World riches. However, the Amerindian populations were decimated by European diseases and colonial exploitation. As for the Europeans, they died at work under the humid heat of the tropics or infected by malaria. To address this labor shortage, the very first colonists in the Americas, Portuguese, Spanish, then French and English, turned to the rich and powerful kingdoms they had encountered on the coasts of West Africa. And the trade, or rather the crime they would devise together, would become a curse for the whole of Africa. European orchestrated human trafficking. With the help of great West African kingdoms, such as the Kingdom of Dahomey in present-day Benin or the Kingdom of Congo in what is now Angola, they would gradually depopulate sub-Saharan Africa and entrench ethnic conflicts whose wounds still persist today. Consider that it is estimated that for every African who was enslaved in America after being forcibly taken from their land, there were 2 others who perished at sea or in armed conflicts related to their capture. In fact, for a long time, Africans outnumbered Europeans on American soil, mainly in Brazil and the Caribbean. In total, between 12 and 20 million Africans were deported over 400 years of slavery. Only 10 to 20% of those arriving in Brazil and the Caribbean escaped the plantations. They would become maroons, fugitives. Their underground history, their encounters with the Amerindian peoples, were absent from history books for a long time. Archaeology is now trying to find traces of these events that were never written down. Others stayed on the plantations until they organized revolts, like the one that led to the independence of Haiti or Saint-Domingue. All these Africans who were uprooted with no more consideration than for plants are at the heart of the history of the Great Columbian Exchange, at the heart of the history of the Americas, at the heart of the history of the great modern struggles. On this continent, which by force of circumstance became theirs, these deported people and their descendants would create a new, mixed world, inventing music and dances, dishes that are now listed as intangible cultural heritage of humanity and that shape, from north to south, contemporary American cultures. Dishes like jambalaya in Louisiana or feijoada in Brazil have African roots and can be included. My chili con carne is an edible symbol of the Great Columbian Exchange. Think about it the next time you cook. World history is right there, nestled on your plate. In the early 21st century, globalization keeps changing our recipes, cultures, and ecosystems, with the main actors in this rapid and endless recombination being men, women, ships, plants, and animals, and occasionally viruses and bacteria that haven't had their last word.